Welcome to Wild Cowboy Tales, your home for the most rugged and riveting stories ever kicked up by the dust of the American West. We tell the tales of the brave, the bold, and the broken, and the legends they carve into the unforgiving frontier. Before we board today's express, do us a favor and subscribe to the channel, and be sure to ring that notification bell. That way, you'll never miss one of our departures into the heart of the wild. Now, find a comfortable seat, hold on tight, and listen to the story they tell from the blistering sands of the Arizona Territory, the tale of the widow who took over the Stagecoach line, and why every thief who boarded never arrived. The Sundown Express wasn't just a stagecoach line, it was Elias Caldwell's heart and soul hammered into steel and hickory. It was a lifeline of progress and communication snaking its way through 300 miles of the most beautiful and brutal country God ever left unfinished. From the dusty hub of Prescott to the distant, sun-bleached outpost of Fort Mojave, Elias's coaches were a promise of delivered mail, of safe passage, of connection in a land defined by isolation. He had built it from a single mud wagon and a team of half-wild Mustangs into the most reliable line in the Arizona Territory. And his wife, Isabella, had been beside him for every dusty mile of that dream. Isabella, or Belle as Elias called her, was not the sort of woman one typically found on the frontier. She had a quiet grace, a love for books, and hands more accustomed to tending a garden than holding a rein. But she possessed a steel spine that Elias had always admired, a resilience as profound and patient as the desert itself. She was the bookkeeper, the planner, the calm harbor to his adventurous spirit. They were a perfect partnership, building a small empire of timetables and horseflesh under the vast, indifferent sky. The end of their world arrived on a Tuesday. It came in the form of the Red Rock Gang, a pack of human coyotes led by a man named Silas Kane. Kane was not a common thug. He was handsome, charismatic, and utterly devoid of a soul. He saw the Sundown Express not as a lifeline, but as a vein of gold waiting to be tapped. For months, his gang had been a plague upon the route, their robberies growing bolder, their violence more pronounced. Elias was not a man to be cowed. He had invested in armed guards and faster horses in studying Kane's methods. He was on the verge of partnering with the U.S. Marshals to lay a trap that would end the Red Rock Gang's reign for good. He was riding as an outrider himself on a coach carrying a decoy strongbox, personally overseeing the final phase of his plan to ensnare Kane. The trap, however, was sprung on him. An informant, a man Elias had trusted, had betrayed him. Kane and his gang weren't at the expected ambush point in Dead Man's Pass. They were waiting 5 miles earlier, in a place of their own choosing. They swarmed the coach with brutal efficiency. The guards were cut down in the first volley. Elias, ever defiant, fought back, but he was outnumbered and outmaneuvered. They didn't just rob the coach. Silas Kane made an example of Elias Caldwell. He dragged him into the dirt in front of the terrified passengers and spoke to him not as a robber to a victim, but as a predator to its prey. "You see, Mr. Caldwell," Kane had said, his voice smooth and cruel, "this land has rules. The strong take, and the weak build things for the strong to take. You should have just kept paying my insurance fees." When Elias spat a mouthful of blood and defiance at his feet, Kane laughed, a sound like cracking stone. He shot Elias once in the gut, a wound meant to be slow and agonizing. He and his men then rode off, leaving Elias to die in his wife's name, his life bleeding out into the unforgiving dust of the very land he had tried to tame. When they brought his body back to Prescott, something inside Isabella broke. The vibrant, loving woman receded, leaving behind a hollow shell filled with a grief so cold and so vast it seemed to suck the warmth from the air around her. The town offered its condolences, its pity. They saw a fragile flower, a gentle soul who would surely wither now that her mighty oak was gone. They expected her to sell the Sundown Express for pennies on the dollar and retreat back east to the civilized world she had come from. The Red Rock Gang expected the same. With Elias gone, they saw the line as their personal property, a cow to be milked at their leisure. They assumed his weak, bookish widow would be no obstacle at all. For a month, Belle did nothing to dissuade them of this notion. She was a ghost in her own home, a woman draped in black, her face a pale, emotionless mask. She attended to the funeral, she accepted the casseroles and the whispered sympathies, she did everything a grieving widow was supposed to do. But in the silent, sleepless nights, surrounded by Elias's maps and ledgers, her grief began a terrible and strange alchemy. It did not fade into sadness, it crystallized. It hardened into something cold, sharp, and perfectly clear, a single, all-consuming purpose. Justice in the territory was a joke. The nearest marshal was 100 miles away and overworked. The local sheriff was a decent man, but he was outmanned and outgunned by Kane's gang. Direct revenge was a fool's errand, the stuff of dime novels. She was not a gunslinger. She could not face them in a fair fight. But Elias hadn't built his empire with a gun. He had built it with planning, with logistics, with an intimate knowledge of every mile of road, every hidden spring, every loyal employee. He had built her weapon. Her plan began to form, not as a fit of rage, but as a cold, calculated business strategy. She called in Elias's life insurance policy, a considerable sum he had taken out to protect her. She methodically sold off their personal assets, a small parcel of mining land, her own jewelry, anything that wasn't essential to the line. She moved with a quiet, unnerving efficiency that the town's bankers mistook for a desperate need to liquidate. The Sundown Express, wounded by the robberies and the death of its founder, was struggling. The other shareholders were panicking, ready to sell. Belle, using an intermediary lawyer from another town to mask her intentions, began to buy their shares. She bought them at a discount, taking advantage of the very fear Silas Kane had created. The men who sold their shares saw it as unloading a dying horse. They had no idea they were handing the reins of a war machine to its future general. Within 2 months, it was done. Isabella Caldwell, the quiet, grieving widow, held the controlling interest. She owned the Sundown Express outright. The day she walked into the line's main office in Prescott and announced it, the staff was stunned. Jedediah, the old, grizzled station master who had been Elias's first hire, looked at her with a mixture of pity and disbelief. "Mrs. Caldwell Bell," he stammered. "With all due respect, this is no business for a lady, especially not now. Kane will bleed you dry." Bell looked at the old man, her eyes holding a depth of cold resolve he had never seen before. "Mr. Kane seems to believe this line belongs to him, Jedediah," she said, her voice soft but laced with steel. "I am simply taking back my property." The news rippled through the territory. The widow had taken over. It was seen as a folly, a sentimental act by a woman deranged by grief. Silas Kane, when he heard the news, reportedly laughed until tears streamed down his face. The mouse had just claimed ownership of the trap. This, he thought, would be amusing. He and his men, and the entire territory, saw a weak, defenseless woman playing shopkeeper with a man's business. They did not see the architect of a new kind of warfare. They did not see the woman who had just acquired the perfect weapon. They saw a widow who had inherited a stagecoach line. They had no idea she had just declared a silent, deadly war, and that the Sundown Express was about to become the most dangerous ride in the West. Every thief, every killer, every man who had a hand in Elias's death would be invited to take a ride. And she would make a solemn promise to her husband's memory that none of them would ever reach their destination. The first few weeks of Belle's ownership were an exercise in quiet observation. She did not make sweeping changes or grand pronouncements. Instead, she immersed herself in the intricate machinery of the Sundown Express, learning its rhythms, its strengths, and, most importantly, its vulnerabilities. She spent 18 hours a day in the main office, a black-clad wraith surrounded by the monuments of her husband's life, route maps stacked to the walls, stacks of manifests and timetables. The faint, lingering scent of his cigar smoke in the leather armchair. To the outside world, she was a grieving widow clinging to her husband's legacy. In reality, she was a general studying her battlefield. She identified her key assets. The first was Jedediah, the old station master. He was fiercely loyal to Elias's memory, a man whose gruff exterior hid a sharp mind and an encyclopedic knowledge of the line's operations. He saw her dedication, and his pity slowly transformed into a cautious respect. Her second, and most vital, asset was a man named Marcus Rourke. Marcus was the line's lead driver, a man as weathered and reliable as the granite hills he navigated. He was a former Army scout, quiet and watchful, with hands that could gentle a spooked horse or handle a shotgun with equal and hurried skill. Elias had trusted him implicitly, not just with the coach, but with his life. He had been driving the decoy coach the day Elias was killed, a fact that had settled a heavy and spoken guilt upon his shoulders. Dale summoned Marcus to the office one evening after everyone else had gone home. The room was lit by a single kerosene lamp, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. "Marcus," she began, her voice calm and direct. "You were with my husband on his last ride." Marcus, a man who rarely showed emotion, flinched as if struck. "Yes, ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble. I should have." "You could have done nothing," Belle interrupted, her gaze unwavering. This was not a failure of arms, but of intelligence, of trust. He was betrayed. She paused, letting the weight of the word hang in the air. "I intend to find the man who betrayed him. And I intend to dismantle Silas Kane's entire operation, piece by piece." Marcus stared at her. This was not the broken woman the town whispered about. There was a fire in her eyes, a chilling intensity that commanded his full attention. "That's a tall order, ma'am," he said slowly. "The law can't touch Kane." "I am not the law," Belle replied. "The law requires evidence and witnesses. I have no need for either. I have this." She swept her hand, indicating the maps, the ledgers, the entire nervous system of the Sundown Express spread before them. "Kane and his men, they are arrogant. They use our line. They use our stations for water and information. They use our coaches to transport their goods and their people, hiding in plain sight. They see it as their right. From now on, that arrogance will be their undoing." This was her oath, sworn not in a church but in a dusty office, to an audience of one loyal driver. It was not a vow of blind, bloody revenge. It was a declaration of strategic warfare. "Every man who rides with Kane, every man who profits from my husband's murder, will find their end on this line," she stated, her voice dropping to an icy whisper. "They will board my coaches, and they will not get off. They will not be shot down in the street. They will simply disappear. The Sundown Express will become a ghost train for guilty men." Marcus was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on her face, searching for any hint of madness or delusion. He found none. He found only a terrifying resolve. He thought of Elias, the best man he had ever known, dying in the dirt. He thought of his own powerlessness that day. Belle was offering him a chance not at revenge, but at redemption. "What do you need me to do?" he asked, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "For now, you will be my eyes and ears. You will drive your routes, and you will listen. You will identify the weak links in Kane's chain. The informants, the bagmen, the ones who think themselves safe because they don't carry a gun." She then turned to a large map of the territory. "And you will help me learn. I want to know every turn, every dry wash, every shortcut. I want to know the places where a coach can be delayed for 10 minutes without raising suspicion. I want to know where a man could get lost and never be found." Their alliance was forged in that lamplit room, a secret pact to turn a commercial enterprise into an instrument of retribution. Belle's strategy was one of absolute control. She began by subtly changing the manifests and the way cargo was loaded. She designated certain compartments on the coachesmal, out-of-the-way space for her exclusive use. She had Marcus, a skilled carpenter in his own right, begin making small, ingenious modifications to the coaches he drove. A false bottom in a passenger's footlocker, a hollowed-out section in a roof beam, a water barrel with a hidden, watertight compartment. These were not yet weapons, they were preparations for a new kind of cargo. She also took control of the information. Using the line's private telegraph, she began to communicate with station masters using a simple code she and Elias had once developed as a game. She could now send and receive messages that would be unintelligible to any of Kane's prying eyes. She knew which wells were running dry, which mountain passes were expecting early snow, which river crossings were flooded. She possessed a god's-eye view of the entire territory, and she could manipulate her stagecoach's movements with a precision that bordered on clairvoyance. Jedediah, though not privy to the dark details of her plan, became an unwitting but crucial accomplice. Belle put him in charge of hiring new station hands and guards, with a simple, private instruction: hire men who are desperate, men who are in debt, men loyal to coin above all else. She overpaid them, creating a network of employees whose loyalty was to her, and her alone. She could now ensure that at certain remote way stations, the staff would be conveniently absent or willing to look the other way for a specific 10-minute window. She was turning the Sundown Express into a web. The coaches were the strands, the stations were the anchor points, and she was the spider at the center, feeling the vibrations, waiting patiently for the first fly to blunder into her meticulously constructed trap. Her enemies, meanwhile, saw only what she wanted them to see. They saw a woman struggling with ledgers. They saw coaches that were sometimes late, a sign of inefficiency. They saw new hires that they could easily bribe, not realizing these men were already bought and paid for by a higher, more secretive power. They saw a stagecoach line in decline, run by a weak, sentimental woman. They saw the perfect victim. One evening, Marcus brought her the information she had been waiting for. "Lefty Pete," he said, his voice low. "He runs the telegraph at the Rock Creek Way station. I've seen him talking to Kane's men, passing notes. Jedediah says he's always asking about cargo manifests, especially bullion shipments." Belle looked at the map, her finger tracing the route to the Rock Creek station. "Lefty Pete," she repeated, the name like a chip of ice in her mouth. He was the informant, the one who had betrayed Elias. A wave of pure, cold hatred washed over her, so intense it almost took her breath away. She steadied herself, her face becoming a placid mask once more. The time for emotion was over. The time for planning was at hand. She had found her first passenger. The Sundown Express was about to make its first unscheduled and permanent stop. The oath had been sworn, the strategy was in place, and the timetable for revenge was about to be written. The transformation of Isabella Caldwell was not a process of learning to shoot faster or fight harder. It was a transformation of the mind. The gentle, book-loving woman did not vanish, she was repurposed. Her meticulous attention to detail, once used for balancing ledgers, was now applied to designing traps. Her quiet, observant nature, once a trait of a demure wife, became the tool of a patient predator. She was not becoming a warrior, she was becoming an architect of vengeance, and the stagecoaches of the Sundown Express were to be her masterpieces of mobile destruction. Her workshop was the cavernous coach house behind the main office, a place that smelled of sawdust, leather, and grease. Her collaborator was Marcus Rourke. Under the cloak of night, long after the town of Prescott had gone to sleep, they worked by the light of shielded lanterns, converting the tools of commerce into instruments of her deadly trade. "I am not a killer, Marcus," she said one night, her voice a low murmur that was almost lost in the vast, dark space. They were standing beside one of the heavy Concorde coaches, its familiar shape looking menacing in the shadows. "Not in my heart. I cannot simply shoot a man down. That is their way. My way must be cleaner. It must be inescapable. It must feel like fate." Her first designs were born from this philosophy. They were not overt weapons, but subtle, insidious modifications woven into the very fabric of the coach. She began with the problem of Lefty Pete, the telegraph operator. He was an informant, a man who dealt in secrets. Belle decided he would die by a secret. "The strongbox," she said, tapping a charcoal sketch she had drawn on a plank of wood. "The one we use for valuable payrolls or bank transfers. It is a symbol of everything they desire." Her design was diabolical in its ingenuity. She had Marcus take a standard, iron-banded strongbox and rebuild its interior. He constructed a false back, creating a hidden compartment. Within this compartment, he installed a simple mechanism triggered by the lock. When the correct key was used, the box would open normally. But if the lock was forced, or if a counterfeit key was used to turn the tumbler past a certain point, it would trip a small, spring-loaded hammer. The hammer's purpose was not to fire a bullet. It was to strike a glass vial. Bill had spent days researching, poring through old medical texts she ordered from back east. She had found what she was looking for, a recipe for a concentrated tincture of wolfsbane and oleander, mixed with a fast-evaporating solvent. The resulting chemical was not a poison in the traditional sense. When the vial shattered, the liquid would instantly vaporize, releasing a colorless, odorless gas that was a powerful and lethal neurotoxin. It attacked the nervous system, causing rapid paralysis of the respiratory system. The death would be silent, quick, and would leave behind almost no trace, mimicking the symptoms of a sudden, catastrophic heart failure or stroke. Crafting the device took a week of painstaking work. Marcus, with his steady, skilled hands, built the mechanism. Belle, her face protected by a heavy cloth, carefully mixed the volatile chemicals in a secluded corner of her garden, her knowledge of botany twisted into a dark new art. The final product was a normal-looking strongbox that was, in fact, a sophisticated gas bomb. But the traps were only half of her transformation. She had to understand the tools of her enemies. "I need to know how they think, how they fight," she told Marcus. "Teach me." He took her out into the desert, far from prying eyes. He didn't teach her to be a quick-draw artist. He taught her the practical, brutal reality of a frontier gun. He taught her how to load, clean, and handle a shotgun, the preferred weapon of a stagecoach guard. He made her feel its weight, its powerful and forgiving kick. He taught her how to aim a rifle, not for speed, but for a single, deliberate, well-placed shot. She was not a natural, but she was a dedicated student. The recoil of the shotgun bruised her shoulder. The crack of the rifle made her ears ring. But with each shot, a piece of the old Isabella was chipped away, replaced by something harder. She was not learning to be an attacker, but a defender. She was learning to understand the violence that had been visited upon her, to dissect it, and ultimately, to turn it back upon its perpetrators. Her greatest transformation, however, was strategic. She spread out Elias's detailed route maps on her dining room table, and they became her chessboard. She memorized every mile. She knew which stretches of road were hard-pan clay, where the wheels were loud, and which were deep sand, where the coach moved in a natural silence. She knew where a team of horses would be tired and slow at the top of a grade, and where they would be running free on a long downhill stretch. She began to orchestrate the movements of her coaches like a maestro conducting a symphony. She would invent de laisse lame horse, a stuck wheel that would cause a specific coach to arrive at a specific point on the route at a precise time of her choosing. She could create a window of opportunity, a bubble of isolation in the vast emptiness of the desert, whenever she needed one. Jedediah, watching her work, saw a woman possessed. "Belle," he said one day, his voice laced with concern, "you're not eating. You're not sleeping. This line, it will kill you, same as it killed Elias, just slower." Belle looked up from a timetable, her eyes dark and intense. "Elias died because he was a good man in a bad world, Jedediah," she said. "I do not intend to make the same mistake. I am not trying to be a good woman. I am trying to be the one who survives." The final piece of her preparation was a network of loyalists. She used the line's cash reserves to put several key people on her private payroll. A stable hand at the Rock Creek station, a man with a gambling debt, was paid to report on Lefty Pete's every move. The driver of the eastbound coach was paid to accidentally misplace a mailbag, creating a plausible reason for Bill to dispatch a special and scheduled run. She was building a web of deception, with herself at the center, pulling the strings. By the end of the month, the architect had completed her designs. The trap was built, the bait was ready, the route was planned. All that was left was to extend the invitation. She drafted a false manifest for a special coach, listing a shipment of U.S. Army payroll being transported to Fort Yuma. She made sure the manifest was left on the telegraph desk in Prescott, where a known associate of Lefty Pete's would be sure to see it. The information was telegraphed down the line, and as expected, Lefty Pete at the Rock Creek station received the message. The bait was in the water. The trap was set. The stagecoach, carrying a silent, deadly secret in its belly, was about to roll. Belle stood on the loading dock, watching Marcus climb into the driver's seat of the specially prepared coach. She looked like the concerned owner, seeing a driver off on a dangerous run. But her eyes were cold, her heart was steady. She was not a widow mourning her husband. She was a hunter sending out her lure, and she could already taste the first, bitter drops of her revenge. The plan for Lefty Pete was a study in psychological manipulation. Belle knew he was not a fighter, he was a creature of opportunity, a jackal who fed on the kills of stronger predators. He wouldn't risk a direct confrontation. He would use his position and his key to open the strongbox when the coach was at its most vulnerable, during the overnight stop at the Rock Creek station. The Rock Creek station was little more than a collection of adobe buildings huddled against the vast, star-dusted emptiness of the desert, a stable, a bunkhouse, and a small office where the telegraph clattered day and night. It was an island of dim light and human activity in an ocean of silence. Marcus drove the special run, a single, heavy Concord coach pulled by a team of 6 powerful horses. He carried no passengers. The only cargo of note was the iron-banded strongbox, bolted securely to the floor of the coach, in plain sight. It was a tantalizing prize, sitting there in the empty coach, radiating an aura of immense value. Marcus played his part to perfection. He arrived at Rock Creek 2 hours after dusk, his horses lathered, the coach covered in a fine layer of red dust. He looked tired and stressed, like a man burdened by a heavy responsibility. Got the army payroll, he grumbled to the stable hand on Bell's payroll as he unhitched the team. The widow's worried sick about it. Wants me to sleep with one eye open. Lefty Pete, a small, weaselly man with nervous, darting eyes, watched the exchange from the office doorway. His greedy gaze was fixed on the coach. The information from his associate in Prescott had been correct. The bait was real. As per standard procedure for high-value cargo, the coach was to be locked in the stable overnight, with the station hands standing guard. This was the moment Bell's plan hinged on. The stable hand, following Bell's instructions, pulled Marcus aside. "Jedediah sent a wire," the hand said, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. "Said there's talk of Kane's men being spotted a few miles east of here. He said for the guards to take up positions out on the perimeter, not to just sit by the stable door. Wants to spot them coming." It was a plausible lie. It made tactical sense. And it achieved Bell's primary objective. It drew the guards away from the immediate vicinity of the coach, giving Lefty Pete the window of opportunity he craved. Lefty watched the 2 guards take their shotguns and melt into the darkness of the surrounding rocks. Marcus went into the bunkhouse, looking for all the world like a man about to collapse into his bunk. The station was quiet. The coach, and the fortune it supposedly held, was alone. Bell had anticipated that Lefty's greed would be warring with his cowardice. He wouldn't act immediately. He would wait. He would let the silence stretch, ensuring the guards were truly gone and that Marcus was asleep. Inside the bunkhouse, Marcus was not asleep. He lay on his cot, fully dressed, his hand resting on the butt of the Colt revolver tucked into his belt. He was listening. An hour passed. Then another. The only sounds were the crickets and the soft sigh of the wind. Then Marcus heard it, the faint, telltale creak of the stable's side door, a door rarely used. Lefty was making his move. Lefty Pete moved through the darkened stable like a rat, his heart pounding in his chest. The massive shape of the stagecoach loomed before him. He slid open the coach door and his eyes fell upon the strongbox. He ran his trembling hands over its cold, iron bands. He had a replica key, provided to him by Kane's lockpick, which he was assured would work perfectly. He inserted the key into the lock. It slid in smoothly. He held his breath and turned it. The tumbler clicked, but it felt strange. It turned a little too far, with a soft, secondary click that was not part of a normal unlocking mechanism. For a terrifying second, Lefty froze. Had he broken the key? He pulled it out. It was intact. He sniffed the air. Nothing. He heard no hiss, no sound. He was safe. A wave of relief washed over him. He chuckled to himself at his own paranoia. He had outsmarted them all. The fortune was his. He didn't know that the soft click was the sound of the spring-loaded hammer striking the glass vial. He didn't know that the silent, colorless gas was already pouring from a tiny, concealed vent in the side of the box, filling the enclosed space of the coach. He didn't know that his first breath had been his last. He reached for the heavy lid of the strongbox, a triumphant grin on his face. But his hands suddenly felt numb and clumsy. A wave of dizziness washed over him. His vision blurred at the edges. A crushing weight settled on his chest, and he couldn't seem to draw breath. Confusion turned to panic. He opened his mouth to cry out, but no sound emerged. He clawed at his own throat, his eyes wide with a silent, terrifying question. He stumbled back, collapsing onto the floor of the coach, his body convulsing once before going still. It was over in less than 30 seconds. Marcus waited another 10 minutes, then rose from his bunk. He moved silently to the stable. He peered inside. In the faint moonlight filtering through the dusty window, he could see Lefty Pete's body, crumpled on the floor of the coach. He followed Bell's instructions precisely. He held his own breath and, using a long pole, pushed open both doors of the coach, allowing the night breeze to circulate and disperse any lingering traces of the gas. After waiting a full 5 minutes, he entered. He checked Lefty's pulse. Nothing. He then used the correct key, the one Bell had given him, to properly open the strongbox. Inside, there was nothing but a few heavy rocks and the shattered, empty remains of the glass vial. He carefully gathered the glass fragments into a leather pouch. Next, he dragged Lefty's body out of the coach and positioned it near the rear wheel, placing the replica key on the ground nearby. He then went to the small telegraph office and, using a metal file, jimmied the lock on the cash drawer, taking the few dollars inside to create the appearance of a simple, botched robbery. Finally, he went and found the guards. "Get back here," he yelled, his voice filled with feigned panic. "Something's wrong. I heard a noise." The scene they returned to was one of tragic, simple greed. Lefty Pete, the telegraph operator, had apparently tried to rob the coach. In his haste and in the darkness, he must have slipped and fallen from the coach, striking his head on the iron-rimmed wheel. A freak accident. A man killed by his own foolishness. When the sheriff arrived the next day, he came to the same conclusion. There were no signs of foul play. The strongbox was untouched. Lefty had a small bruise on his temple, consistent with the fall. The doctor, after a cursory examination, pronounced the death an accident, perhaps brought on by a weak heart. The news of Lefty's demise reached Silas Kane a day later. He was furious, not at the death of an underling, but at the loss of a valuable source of information and the failure to secure the payroll. He saw it as a stroke of incredible bad luck, a testament to Lefty's incompetence. It never once occurred to him that the widow's supposedly struggling Stagecoach line could be anything other than a victim. Back in Prescott, Marcus handed Belle the small leather pouch containing the fragments of the vial. She took it and, without a word, threw it into the roaring fire of her hearth, watching until the last sliver of glass had melted into an unrecognizable blob. One was gone. The first thread had been pulled. The trap had worked perfectly, and no one was the wiser. The legend of the Sundown Express had begun. It was still seen as a line plagued by misfortune, but a new and spoken whisper had started. A whisper that said that some passengers who boarded the widow's coach, for one reason or another, simply never made it to the end of the line. The successful elimination of Lefty Pete was a silent, chilling victory. There was no celebration, no relief. There was only the cold, grim satisfaction of a ledger being balanced, a debt being paid in a currency of fear and finality. For Belle, the act itself, though committed at a distance, left an indelible mark on her soul. She had orchestrated a man's death as calmly as she would have scheduled a coach's departure. The realization of this new, cold capacity within her was a heavier burden than any strongbox. Her internal world became a landscape as stark as the desert her coaches traversed. During the day, she was the consummate professional Mrs. Caldwell, the stoic, efficient owner of the Sundown Express. She managed payrolls, negotiated contracts for hay, and oversaw the complex dance of her expanding network. But at night, alone in the house that was once filled with Elias's laughter, the ghosts came to call. She would sit in his leather armchair, running her hand over the worn arms, and the full weight of her actions would settle upon her. This wasn't a war of passion, but of chilling logic. And that, she found, was the most terrifying part. She felt no rage, only a profound, hollow purpose. Each man on her list was a problem to be solved, an equation to be balanced. She was losing the woman Elias had loved, bit by bit, with every secret telegram and every modified coach part. This quiet agony became her penance, the price she paid for the justice she was seizing. She was not just hunting monsters, she was fighting the one that was growing in her own heart. Her next target was a man named Cutter Malone. He was the opposite of Lefty Pete in every way. Where Lefty was a weasel, Cutter was a wolf. He was the muscle of the Red Rock Gang, a hulking brute of a man known for his skill with a bowie knife and his love of physical intimidation. He had been the one to hold the passengers at bay the day Elias was killed, his cruel laughter echoing as his leader delivered the fatal shot. Belle knew that a subtle trap like a gas-filled box would never work on a man like Cutter. He was a creature of direct, physical violence. He would have to be defeated by it. Marcus brought her the intelligence. Cutter's been shaking down prospectors in the Gila Bend region, he reported. He likes to ride alongside the coaches, not as a passenger, but as a shadow. He frightens people, makes them pay for protection. He thinks he's untouchable. Bill's mind began to work, assembling the pieces. Cutter's arrogance was his weakness. His belief in his own physical superiority was the flaw she would exploit. She wouldn't try to ambush him from a distance. She would invite him onto her stage. The plan she devised was audacious and fraught with risk, requiring perfect timing and a new, trusted operative. She found him in a man named Silas, a down-on-his-luck gambler with nerves of steel and a deep-seated hatred for the Red Rock Gang, who had cost him his meager fortune in a rigged game. For a substantial fee and the promise of a clean slate elsewhere, he agreed to play a dangerous role. Silas would pose as a wealthy geologist, traveling the Sundown Line to survey new claims. He would carry several heavy, but seemingly ordinary, sample crates. He would also be a talker, a boaster, letting it be known in every saloon from Prescott to Gila Bend that he was on the verge of a massive silver strike. He was to be the bait, a fat, juicy worm dangling in front of a hungry fish. The real trap, however, was the coach itself. Bill and Marcus spent 3 nights modifying the interior of a specific mud wagon, a lighter, more rugged coach used on the rougher sections of the route. They focused on the cargo storage. On top of the coach, they rigged one of the heavy sample crates, this one filled with lead weights, to a simple but effective release mechanism. A single, specific leather strap among the many securing the luggage was, in fact, the trigger. A firm, sharp pull downwards would release the pins holding the crate in place. The chosen location for the trap was a stretch of road known as the Spineback, a narrow ridge with a steep, rocky drop-off on one side. The road here was notoriously rough, forcing the coach to slow to a crawl, the wheels bumping and lurching. It was a place where a man could easily lose his footing. The day of the operation arrived. Silas, the gambler, played his part with theatrical flair, his loud talk of silver mines echoing through Prescott. He boarded the modified coach, his crates loaded by Marcus himself. The trap was set. Bill watched the coach depart, a knot of ice in her stomach. This was different from before. She was sending two men, Marcus and Silas, into direct peril. Her manifest no longer just listed cargo, it listed human lives she was responsible for. The weight of it was immense, but she bore it, her face an unreadable mask. As predicted, Cutter Malone took the bait. He and one other gang member began shadowing the coach about 10 miles out from the Spineback. They rode alongside, their presence a palpable threat. Cutter eyed the wealthy geologist through the window, a predatory grin on his face. As the coach began its slow, bumpy ascent onto the Spineback, Cutter made his move. "All right, Professor," he yelled, urging his horse right alongside the lurching coach. "Time for you to make a donation to the Red Rock Retirement Fund." He swung himself from his saddle onto the side of the coach with surprising agility for a big man, his boots finding purchase on the iron step. The other rider kept pace, his gun drawn, covering Marcus. "Just keep driving, old man," the rider warned. Cutter pulled himself up, his massive frame blocking the light from the window. He leered at Silas. "Now, you and me are going to have a little talk about silver." Silas, his face a mask of practiced terror, shrank back in his seat. Cutter, enjoying the fear, laughed and began to climb towards the roof, intending to get at the luggage. "I'll just take a look at these samples myself," he crowed. As he hauled his bulk onto the roof, he grabbed a thick leather strap to steady himself against the coach's violent lurching. It was the trigger strap. Inside the coach, Silas braced himself. On the driver's box, Marcus held the reins steady, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Cutter gave the strap a final, mighty heave to pull himself fully upright. The release mechanism fired with a dull thunk. The pins shot back. The heavy, lead-filled crate, dislodged by the combination of the release and the violent rocking of the coach, slid sideways. Cutter, his hands still on the strap, had no time to react. The crate, weighing over 300 pounds, slammed into him. It didn't push him, it demolished him. A strangled cry was torn from his lips as he was swatted from the roof of the coach like a fly. He and the heavy crate tumbled down the steep, rocky embankment in a horrible avalanche of splintering wood, tearing canvas, and a single, screaming man. The series of sickening crunches from below told the story. The other rider, stunned by the sudden, shocking turn of events, stared in disbelief at the spot where his partner had been. In that moment of distraction, Marcus acted. He had a shotgun, a greener loaded with rock salt, clamped beneath his seat. In one fluid motion, he dropped the reins, snatched the shotgun, and fired. The blast, not lethal but agonizingly painful, caught the rider full in the chest and face. The man shrieked and fell from his horse, blinded and peppered with stinging salt. He was out of the fight. Marcus calmly pulled the coach to a halt, set the brake, and took up his real shotgun. The blinded rider was writhing on the ground, no longer a threat. Below, in the ravine, there was only silence. The official story was simple and tragic. A notorious outlaw, Cutter Malone, had attempted to rob the Sundown Express. In his arrogance, he had tried to climb aboard the moving coach on a treacherous piece of road, had lost his footing, and had fallen to his death. A true, if unfortunate, accident. His partner had been driven off by the brave actions of the driver, Marcus Rourke. Marcus was hailed as a hero. Silas, the gambler, was paid handsomely and put on the next coach east, disappearing forever. When Marcus returned to Prescott, he met with Belle in the silent coach house. He did not speak of what had happened. He simply placed a large, distinctive Bowie knife on her desk. Cutter's knife. Belle looked at it, the polished steel gleaming in the lamplight. This was a tangible piece of her victory, a trophy from her hunt. But it did not feel like a triumph. It felt heavy. It was another weight added to the manifest of her soul. Two were gone, but Kane's gang was more than just a collection of individuals. It was a living, breathing monster, and she had now taken two of its limbs. The monster was wounded, and it was angry. She knew its head, Silas Kane himself, would now be turning his cold, calculating eyes fully upon her. The game was escalating. The accidental deaths of two key members of his gang in as many months had stripped away Silas Kane's amusement and replaced it with a cold, gnawing suspicion. Lefty's fall was bad luck. Cutter's was a coincidence. Together, they formed a pattern that his sharp, criminal mind could not ignore. These were not accidents. They were too neat, too perfect, too beneficial to one person, the quiet widow who now ran the Sundown Express. He couldn't prove anything, but he no longer needed proof. He knew, with the instinct of a predator that feels the hunter's presence, that she was behind it. But how? The question gnawed at him. He needed answers. He needed to send in someone who could see what he was missing, someone who could dissect the accidents and expose the hand that was guiding them. He sent for Hawk. Hawk was not a typical member of the Red Rock gang. He was not a brawler or a drunk. He was a quiet, observant man, half Comanche, who had served as an army scout before his dishonorable discharge. His skills were legendary. He could read a trail on solid rock and see a lie in a man's eyes from 100 paces. He was Kane's ghost, his troubleshooter, the one he sent in when a situation required a scalpel instead of a hammer. Find out what's happening, Kane ordered him in their camp. Ride the line. Watch the drivers. Watch the stations. Watch the widow. These aren't accidents. Find me the proof. Find me the ghost. Hawk nodded once, his dark eyes betraying nothing, and the next day, he bought a ticket in a small town east of Prescott, boarding a Sundown coach under the guise of a prospector. Belle, through her network, knew of Hawk's existence. Marcus had described him. He's the one you don't see coming. He watches everything. Belle understood that Hawk was her most dangerous opponent yet. He could not be tricked by a mechanical device or a simple ruse. He was a hunter of secrets, and she was a woman made of them. To defeat Hawk, she would have to lay a trap not for his body, but for his mind. She had to give him the pattern he was looking for, and then use that very pattern to destroy him. Her next target was a man named Sammy the Shiver Jones, so called because of a perpetual nervous tremor in his hands. Sammy was the gang's paymaster, the one who laundered their stolen money and handled their logistics. He was a coward at heart, terrified of Kane, but addicted to the wealth the gang provided. Belle's plan for Sammy was designed with Hawk in mind. It had to be another accident, one that would occur right under Hawk's watchful eyes. It had to look plausible, but just flawed enough to make a man like Hawk suspect a human element. The trap was centered on a remote way station in the middle of the Chenega Grande, a vast, flat alkali basin known for two things: its oppressive summer heat and its huge population of aggressive rattlesnakes, who nested in the rocky outcrops that dotted the landscape. Belle began by orchestrating a breakdown. She had Marcus subtly sabotage the coach that Sammy and Hawk were both booked on. A small, slow leak in the axle grease reservoir, almost impossible to detect on a pre-trip inspection. would cause the wheel bearing to overheat and seize up about 5 miles from the Chenega Grande station. It was a common enough occurrence on the rugged frontier roads. The coach ground to a halt in the middle of the shimmering salt flats, under the brutal glare of the afternoon sun. The driver, a man loyal to Belle, cursed and announced that they would have to walk the rest of the way to the station to get a replacement part. The small group of passengers began the hot, miserable trek. There was Hawk, his eyes missing nothing, his pace unhurried. There was Sammy the Shiver, complaining constantly, his face pale with exertion. And there were 3 other passengers, all of them on Belle's payroll, hired to play the part of grumbling travelers. When they finally reached the station master of Belle's men was a picture of stressed incompetence. The spare wheels cracked, he announced, throwing his hands up in despair. I've sent a telegraph for a replacement wagon, but it won't get here till morning. You'll all have to spend the night. The stage was set. A group of people stranded in a desolate, snake-infested location. As dusk fell, a new element of the trap was introduced. The station master brought out a bottle of cheap, potent whiskey. On the house, for your troubles, he said. The other passengers eagerly accepted, starting a loud, boisterous card game. Sammy, a man who always sought solace in the bottle, joined them. Hawk declined, preferring to sit in a quiet corner, watching. The whiskey Sammy was drinking was drugged. It wasn't a poison, but a mild hallucinogen mixed with a chemical that induced paranoia and heightened anxiety. For a man already nicknamed the Shiver, the effect would be pronounced. As the night wore on, Sammy became increasingly agitated. The flickering lamplight seemed to cast menacing shadows. The normal chirping of the crickets sounded like whispers. He started seeing things in the corners of his eyes. He became convinced someone was trying to cheat him in the card game. The final piece of the trap was sprung just after midnight. The station master's pet dog began barking frantically outside. Damn snakes, the station master grumbled. They get brave at night. One of them's probably got cornered up against the bunkhouse wall. He grabbed a lantern and his shotgun. Don't nobody go outside till I clear it. This was the suggestion, the seed planted in Sammy's paranoid, drug-addled mind. Snakes outside. 10 minutes later, one of Belle's men, who had been losing to Sammy, accused him of cheating. The accusation was loud and aggressive. Sammy, his nerves screaming, jumped to his feet, protesting his innocence. A heated argument erupted, exactly as planned. In the chaos, another of Belle's men accidentally knocked over the only lantern, plunging the main room into darkness. People shouted in the dark. Someone lit a match. In that brief, flickering light, Sammy, utterly terrified and disoriented, did the one thing he thought would save him. He bolted. He didn't run towards the front door, where the argument was. He ran for the back door of the bunkhouse, seeking escape. The back door opened onto a narrow, rocky path that led to the outhouse. It was also, as Belle knew from detailed maps and Marcus's scouting, the location of a large, active rattlesnake den. The station master's earlier performance had not been a lie. It had been a carefully timed piece of foreshadowing. Sammy burst out into the moonlight, his heart hammering. He heard a noise in the rocks beside him, sound of a single, well-thrown pebble, tossed by the station master who was waiting in the shadows. To Sammy, it sounded like the hiss of a snake. He cried out and leaped sideways, off the path, stumbling directly into the heart of the nesting ground. The night erupted with the sound of a dozen angry rattles. Sammy's scream was high and short. When Hawk and the others reached him, it was too late. He was dead, his body already beginning to swell from multiple venomous bites. To everyone else, it was a horrific tragedy. A drunken, panicked man had run blindly into a snake den. Hawk, however, saw the gears of the machine, the convenient breakdown, the incompetent station master, the drugged whiskey, the perfectly timed argument. It was too much. This was murder. An intricate, brilliant, and traceable murder. He knew then, with absolute certainty, that the widow was not just a ghost. She was a master puppeteer, and he knew that he had been allowed to see this, to figure it out. This entire performance had been for his benefit. The realization sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the cool desert night. This wasn't a trap for Sammy. It was a message for him. I know you're here. I can do this right in front of you, and you can't stop me. Hawk understood that he was no longer the hunter. He was the hunted. And the ghost he was chasing was more cunning and more dangerous than any man he had ever tracked. Hawk returned to the Red Rock Gang's camp a changed man. The quiet confidence was gone, replaced by a haunted, grim awareness. He stood before Silas Kane and laid out his story, not as a series of facts, but as a chilling narrative of an invisible, omniscient enemy. "She's a spider, Silas," Hawk said, his voice low and intense. "And the whole damn Sundown Express is her web. The drivers, the station masters, the coaches, they're all part of it. She sabotaged the coach. She drugged the whiskey. She used Sammy's own fear to drive him into that snake pit. She did it right in front of me. She wanted me to see it." Kane listened, his handsome face hardening into a mask of cold fury. The truth was more terrifying than he had imagined. This wasn't a grieving widow lashing out. This was a methodical, patient extermination. She wasn't just killing his men, she was dismantling his empire, turning his own assets against him, making him a fool. The fear he had so expertly wielded against others was now being turned back on him, refined into an art form. The last few members of his gang, already spooked by the string of accidents, listened to Hawk's tale with wide, terrified eyes. The Red Rock Gang, once the most feared outfit in the territory, was broken. That night, 3 of them deserted, melting into the darkness, wanting no part of a war against a ghost. By morning, only Kane and Hawk remained. The gang was gone. "So we run?" Kane asked, his voice a venomous hiss. It was not a real question. It was a test. "You can't run from this," Hawk replied, his gaze steady. "She controls the roads. She knows the territory better than we do. She'll pick us off on the trail, just like the others. There's only one way to fight a spider." "And what's that?" Kane sneered. "You have to burn the web," Hawk said simply. "You have to force her out into the open, away from her traps and her timetables." A new, terrible light gleamed in Silas Kane's eyes. The fear was burning away, leaving behind the pure, distilled essence of his evil. He was a cornered serpent, and a cornered serpent is at its most dangerous. He would no longer try to steal from the widow. He would destroy her. He would take away everything she had left. His plan was brutal and direct. He and Hawk would not wait in the wilderness. They would ride into the heart of her power at Prescott. They would not challenge her to a duel. That was a fool's game, a dance to her music. They would take a hostage. They would seize the one piece of the web she couldn't afford to lose, the one man who was not just an employee but a true link to her past, a piece of her dead husband's legacy. They rode into Prescott at dawn 2 days later. The town was just waking up, the streets quiet. They didn't ride in shooting. They moved like ghosts themselves, their faces grim. Their destination was the Sundown Express main office. Jedediah, the old station master, was there alone, preparing the morning manifests as he had done every day for 20 years. He looked up as the 2 men entered, his eyes widening in recognition and fear. "Kane," he rasped, reaching instinctively for the old shotgun he kept behind the counter. He was too slow. Hawk moved with a blur of motion, disarming him with a sharp, practiced blow. Kane smiled, a chilling expression devoid of all warmth. "Good morning, Jedediah," Kane said smoothly. "You and I are going to help Mrs. Caldwell plan a very special, final trip." They barricaded the doors. From a window, Kane fired a single shot into the air to get the town's attention. When the sheriff cautiously approached, Kane's voice rang out, clear and cold. "Sheriff, I have the old man. Here is the deal. I want a coach. The best and fastest you have. I want it provisioned for 3 days. And I want the widow to drive it. Just her. No guards, no tricks. She will drive me and my associate out of this territory. If I see anyone follow, if I suspect any tricks, Jedediah dies." The ultimatum was a stroke of evil genius. Kane had turned her own weapon against her. He would ride her stagecoach, with her at the reins, making her the instrument of his escape. It was the ultimate humiliation, the ultimate act of dominance. He was forcing the spider out of the web and making her carry him to safety. The news reached Belle at her home. Marcus, his face a mask of rage, was with her. "It's a trap, Belle," he said, his hand gripping his pistol. "He'll kill you the second you're clear of town. Let me get a few men. We can rush the office. And Jedediah will be dead before the first shot is fired," Belle said, her voice unnervingly calm. She walked to the window and looked out at the town she had silently been fighting for. It was quiet now, paralyzed by fear. Kane had seized control. She felt a strange sense of clarity. The long, secret war was over. The time for traps and whispers was done. Kane had made his final move, and he had made it on her board, in her town. He thought he was in control, but he was standing in the very center of her power, surrounded by people whose loyalty she had quietly earned. He was just too arrogant to see it. "He wants a special trip," Belle said, turning from the window. A faint, cold smile touched her lips for the first time in months. "Then he shall have one. Marcus, go to the coach house. I want you to prepare the Midnight Star." The Midnight Star was Elias's masterpiece, a custom-built coach, lighter and faster than any other, with a reinforced chassis and a unique suspension system. It was a coach built for speed and endurance. It was also the coach she and Marcus had spent the most time modifying, the one with all their most ingenious and deadly secrets built into its very frame. "He wants me to drive him," Belle said, her eyes gleaming with a terrible, bright light. "He thinks he is my passenger. He is wrong. He is my cargo, and I will deliver him." The serpent had coiled and struck, taking her queen's bishop. But the queen herself was now entering the game, and the final checkmate was at hand. The main street of Prescott was a silent theater of dread. Every citizen was an unwilling spectator, watching from behind parted curtains and from the shadowy depths of doorways. They watched as the Midnight Star, the Sundown Express's finest coach, was hitched to a team of 6 magnificent black horses, the best in the territory. They watched as Marcus Rourke, his face like carved granite, stocked the coach with provisions, his movements stiff with a rage he could not unleash. And then they watched as Isabella Caldwell walked from her house. She was not dressed in widow's black. She wore a simple, practical riding skirt, a leather vest over a white blouse, and sturdy boots. On her hip, for all the world to see, was a modest Colt revolver, the kind a woman might carry for protection. She looked not like a victim, but like a driver reporting for duty. Her face was calm, her expression unreadable, and as she walked, a new kind of silence fell over the town, a silence of awe. She climbed into the driver's box of the Midnight Star without a word, taking the heavy leather reins in her hands. The gesture was so assured, so natural, that it sent a clear message: "This is mine. You are on my ground." At her signal, Hawk emerged from the express office, his rifle held steady. He was followed by Silas Kane, who held a pistol pressed firmly against Jedediah's temple. The old station master looked pale but defiant. "A touching display, Mrs. Caldwell," Kane called out, his voice dripping with sarcasm. The loving owner, ready to sacrifice herself for her loyal dog. "It's a shame no one's writing a book about this." He shoved Jedediah into the coach, then motioned for Hawk to get in. Finally, Kane climbed in himself, keeping his pistol trained on the old man. "All right, widow," he commanded. "Let's ride. Head south. And remember, one wrong move, one unexpected stop, and the old man's brains will decorate the upholstery." Belle didn't look back. She simply clicked the reins, and the 6 black horses lunged forward as one. The Midnight Star rolled down the main street and out of Prescott, leaving a stunned and silent town in its wake. The first few hours were a tense, silent war of nerves. Belle drove with an expert's touch, her hands light but firm on the reins. The coach flew across the hard-pan desert, eating up the miles. Inside, Kane sat directly behind her, the muzzle of his pistol never straying from Jedediah. Hawk sat opposite them, his rifle across his lap, his eyes constantly scanning the landscape, watching for any sign of a pursuit or a trap. They saw nothing. The desert was empty, vast, and indifferent. There were no hidden riders, no suspicious dust clouds on the horizon. It seemed the widow was beaten, that she had truly submitted to his will. Kane began to relax, a smirk of triumph playing on his lips. But Belle was not beaten. She was in her element. This coach was her creation, an extension of her own body and will. The landscape, which seemed empty to Kane, was a map she knew by heart. She was not driving aimlessly south. She was heading for a specific destination, a place of her own choosing. As the sun began to sink towards the horizon, casting long, purple shadows across the land, she began her subtle attack. The Midnight Star was fitted with a custom-designed suspension system that Belle and Marcus had secretly altered. By shifting her weight on a specific floorboard in the driver's box, she could subtly stiffen or loosen the suspension on one side of the coach. She started with small, almost imperceptible changes. A slight lurch here, a gentle sway there. On the smooth, flat ground, it was barely noticeable. But as they entered a stretch of rough, broken country, the effect was magnified. The ride inside the coach became jarring and unpredictable. Kane, focused on his hostage, found it increasingly difficult to keep his aim steady. Hawk was forced to brace himself constantly, his attention divided between watching the terrain and keeping his balance. Jedediah, who had been warned by Belle with a prearranged signal, 3 light taps of her foot on the floorboard above him knew to go limp with each lurch, making himself a more difficult and stable target. Belle was using the coach itself to fray their nerves, to wear down their focus, to sow the seeds of chaos in a controlled environment. "Watch the road, damn you," Kane snarled after one particularly violent jolt nearly sent him tumbling. "It's rough country," Belle replied calmly, her voice carried back on the wind, never once turning around. Her second secret weapon was environmental. She knew this route would take them through the alkali sinks at dusk. She had timed it perfectly. As they descended into the low-lying basin, the setting sun was directly behind them. She expertly maneuvered the coach so that its polished side panels caught the last rays of the sun, reflecting a blinding glare directly into the eyes of anyone looking back the way they had come. It was a simple trick, but it made it impossible for Hawk to see if they were being followed, adding another layer to his growing unease. The real trap, however, lay ahead. Belle was driving them towards a place on her map marked with a single, grim word: anvil. The Devil's Anvil was a massive, perfectly flat, dry lake bed, a circle of baked white clay miles across. It was a place with no cover, no shadows, nowhere to hide. It was the last place on Earth anyone would choose for an ambush. And that was precisely why she had chosen it. As darkness fell, Kane ordered her to stop. They made a cold camp in the scrublands bordering the anvil. Kane and Hawk took turns on watch, but their sleep was fitful. The subtle, nerve-wracking ride, the vast silence of the desert, and the sheer unpredictability of the widow had left them on edge. They were winning, but it did not feel like a victory. It felt like they were being led. Belle, feigning exhaustion, slept near the coach. But her mind was wide awake, running through the final steps of her plan. Tomorrow, she would drive them into the center of the anvil. In that vast, empty space, under the heat of the noon sun, she would spring her final, most audacious trap. The long ride was almost over. For Kane and Hawk, it was the end of the line. The sun rose with a brutal, white intensity, promising a day of blistering heat. As they broke camp, Hawk stared out at the shimmering expanse of the Devil's Anvil. "This is a bad place, Silas," he said, his voice low. "Nowhere to run. We're exposed." "Exposed is good," Kane countered, prodding Jedediah towards the coach. "It means she can't have anyone hiding in the rocks. Get in. We cross this today, and by nightfall, we'll be in Mexico. Now drive," he barked at Belle. Belle obeyed without a word, guiding the team of horses onto the baked, cracked surface of the dry lake bed. The coach rolled forward, the only moving thing in a world of white earth and blue sky. The heat was a physical presence, shimmering up from the ground in waves that distorted the horizon. The rhythmic creak of the coach and the plodding of the horses' hooves were the only sounds. They drove for 2 hours, heading for the very center of the vast, flat plain. The isolation was absolute. Kane, feeling the end of his ordeal was near, grew cocky. "You should have just sold the line, widow," he taunted from inside the coach. "You could have gone back east and lived a comfortable life. But you had to be clever. Look where it got you." Belle's hands tightened on the reins. She did not reply. She was watching the sun climb to its zenith. She was waiting for the moment when there would be no shadows. When they reached the dead center of the anvil, she acted. Her right foot pressed down hard on a small, disguised pedal near the brake lever. This was the trigger for the master trap. Simultaneously, her left hand pulled a lever hidden beneath her seat. 2 things happened at once. Underneath the coach, a mechanism fired, releasing a dozen heavy, iron caltrops, vicious, 4-pointed spikes directly into the path of the rear wheels. At the same moment, the hidden lever engaged a powerful, custom-built brake on the front left wheel only, locking it instantly. The effect was catastrophic and brilliant. The front left wheel seized, digging into the clay. The coach, traveling at a considerable speed, was violently wrenched sideways into a screeching, uncontrollable skid. Inside, the laws of physics took over. Kane, Hawk, and Jedediah were thrown against the right side of the coach with incredible force. Jedediah, once again forewarned by a signal from Bell, was braced for it. Kane and Hawk were not. Kane was slammed against the door frame, the breath knocked from his lungs, his pistol flying from his grasp. Hawk, a master of balance, tried to compensate but was overwhelmed by the sheer violence of the maneuver. He crashed into Kane, his rifle clattering to the floor. As the coach skidded, the rear wheels, their momentum unchecked, ran directly over the freshly sewn caltrops. Both tires were instantly shredded, the sound of their bursting lost in the scream of tortured wood and steel. The Midnight Star finally shuddered to a halt, crippled and canted at a crazy angle, a broken monument in the center of the vast, empty anvil. But Belle was already moving. The skid had been violent, but she was the one in control of it. She leaped from the driver's box, not with her small revolver, but with the full-size shotgun she had stowed in a custom-built scabbard by her feet. She landed in the dust, turned, and leveled the shotgun at the coach door just as a dazed and furious Silas Kane was trying to kick it open. "Get out!" Belle's voice rang out, clear and cold in the shimmering heat. Slowly, Kane emerged, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. He was followed by Hawk, who was bleeding from a cut on his forehead but whose eyes were lucid, filled with a kind of grim understanding. He had been beaten. Finally, Jedediah scrambled out, rushing to Belle's side. "You clever bitch," Kane hissed, his hands held slightly away from his body. "You were planning this all along." "From the day you murdered my husband," Belle replied, her voice devoid of all emotion. The shotgun never wavered. "This is the end of the line, Silas. You won't shoot us in cold blood," Kane sneered, trying to find a foothold of control. "You're not a killer." "You're right," Belle said. "I'm not. He is." From behind the crippled coach, a figure emerged. It was Marcus Rourke. He was covered in white alkali dust, looking like an avenging spirit. He held a Winchester rifle, and its aim was rock-steady. Kane and Hawk stared, stunned. "How?" Hawk breathed. "The Midnight Star has a few secrets," Belle explained calmly. "One of them is a reinforced, hollowed-out compartment under the floorboards, just big enough for one man. He's been with us the whole time. You were so busy watching the horizon for my traps, you never thought to look inside." It was the final, perfect deception. While Kane and Hawk were being worn down by the ride, Marcus had been resting, waiting, a ghost in the machine. The standoff was absolute. Two armed men, two unarmed men, separated by 30 feet of sun-baked earth. Kane, realizing he was truly beaten, let his arrogance and rage consume him. With a wild scream, he lunged for the pistol he had dropped inside the coach. He never made it. 2 shots rang out, almost as one. The blast from Belle's shotgun, the crack of Marcus's rifle. Silas Kane was thrown back against the coach, his chest a ruin, his reign of terror over. In the ringing silence that followed, Hawk slowly, deliberately, raised his hands high above his head. He looked at Belle, not with fear, but with a warrior's respect for the victor. "The web was burned," he said quietly, "but the spider was waiting in the ashes." Belle held his gaze, the barrel of her shotgun still smoking. The long hunt was over. All that was left was the dawn. The journey back to Prescott was slow and somber. They left the body of Silas Kane for the vultures and the sun, an unmarked grave in the center of his final, failed battlefield. Hawk rode bound in the back of the crippled coach, a silent, stoic prisoner. They were met by a posse led by the sheriff 10 miles out of town. Belle had, of course, left a detailed message with a trusted station master, outlining her final destination and the time she expected to be there. She had left nothing to chance. When the Midnight Star, pulled by a spare team of horses, limped into Prescott, the town erupted. It was a strange, subdued celebration, a collective exhalation of breath that had been held for months. They were free. Hawk was handed over to the U.S. Marshals who had been summoned, and he faced federal justice without resistance. He never betrayed the full scope of Belle's methods, speaking only of a woman who had outhunted and outfought the most dangerous gang in the territory. In the days that followed, Isabella Caldwell became a figure of legend. The whispers about the unlucky Sundown Express were replaced by a new, more potent myth. They called her the Widow Queen, the spider of the sundown line. They told the story of a woman who had taken her grief and forged it not into a weapon of steel, but into a weapon of logistics, intelligence, and unbreakable will. But the legend felt alien to Belle. Now that the fire of vengeance had burned itself out, she was left with the cold ashes of what she had done. She had orchestrated the deaths of half a dozen men. She had lied, manipulated, and killed. She had saved the town, she had avenged her husband, but she had lost the gentlewoman she once was somewhere along those dusty, blood-soaked roads. A month after the showdown on the anvil, she stood with Marcus on the loading dock, watching the sunset paint the western mountains in hues of orange and purple. "I'm selling the line, Marcus," she said quietly. He looked at her, surprised. "After everything you did to save it." "I didn't save it," she replied, her voice tinged with a deep, unshakable sadness. "I turned it into a weapon. A coffin on wheels. Every time I look at a coach now, I don't see a lifeline, the way Elias did. I see a trap. I see the faces of the men who died in them. Elias built this line to connect people, to bring life to this territory. I used it to bring death. It deserves a better owner." "It won't find one," Marcus said, his loyalty absolute. "You're the strongest person I've ever known, Belle." "Strength is a heavy burden, Marcus," she said. She turned to him, and he saw a flicker of the old Isabella in her eyes, a deep-seated goodness that had not been entirely extinguished. "I want you and Jedediah to buy it from me. You to run it. Run it the way Elias would have." And so she did. She sold the Sundown Express to its most loyal employees for $1. She packed a small bag, and one morning, just before dawn, she boarded the eastbound coach as a passenger this time. No one knows where she went. Some say she returned to the east, finding the quiet, book-filled life she had left behind. Others say she rode west, all the way to the ocean, seeking a place where the horizon was wide enough to hold the memories of all she had done. But her legacy remained, etched into the very soul of the territory. The Sundown Express, under the guidance of Marcus and Jedediah, became the safest and most prosperous line in the American Southwest. And a legend grew with it. A cautionary tale told to any would-be thief or outlaw with ideas about robbing a stagecoach. They say that if you look closely at the door of every coach on the Sundown line, you can see a tiny, almost invisible spider, carved into the wood. And they say that the spirit of the widow who once ruled the line still watches over it. And that any man with a dark heart who dares to board her coach will find himself on a one-way trip, with a final destination that isn't on any map. He'll find himself a passenger on a ghost train, on a journey to the end of the line.